two-state solution. Here's White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. President Trump is an outside-of-the-box thinker and a visionary leader who solves problems that many others claim are unsolvable.
A report into the handling of Axel Rudiger-Barnes found he searched online for the Manchester Arena attack and said he wanted to stab people. The reviews revealed the UK counter-terror programme closed its case into the Southport attacker prematurely. He went on to murder 3 girls. The families of the Nottingham attack victims are calling for killer Vado Calacane to be retried for murder. A report criticised failings that allowed him to escape face-to-face assessments and not take medication. The NHS has apologised unreservedly. And the Lib Dems have called delays to 9 local elections in England a disgraceful stitch-up between Labour and the Tories. The government says they're being postponed as new authorities are being created in those areas. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 52 points at 86.23. The pound buys $1.25 and €1.20. LBC weather dry tonight with isolated showers in northern and western Scotland and a low of -3. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a warm welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. Coming up in the next hour, a topical debate on issues that you want to phone in about. 0345 6060 973. On the panel next to me, making his debut on the programme, Tom Hayes, Labour MP for Bournemouth East. Next to him is Richard Holden, the Conservative Shadow Paymaster General and MP for Basildon and Billericay. To my right, Emma Barr, former Conservative political advisor who recently became a member of Reform UK. And next to her, Rupert Reid, environmentalist who's a co-founder and director of the Climate Majority Project. We'll find out what that is in a bit. And also former strategist for Extinction Rebellion. As I say, the number to call and indeed WhatsApp 0345 6060 973. You can put your question by text on 84850. And do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's kick off with this WhatsApp question from Vaz in Warwick. Donald Trump has said that everyone he's spoken to loves the idea of the US owning Gaza. Do you, Richard Holden?
No, I don't think that sounds like a great idea to me. I think, actually, the truth is that Donald Trump did a lot of good work in the Middle East when he was last president. The Abraham Accords, bringing countries like Morocco and Israel to the peace table for the first time in a long time, actually kicked off a lot of good work, and we actually saw that all the way through until quite recently, when it looked like Israel and Saudi Arabia were about to actually come to a proper agreement. And it was only the intervention of Iran and its allies that broke that up. So President Trump has a particular way of negotiating. We think we've seen that on the international stage in multiple different ways over the last few days. But I think there's obviously what we all probably want to see around this table is a peaceful solution in the Middle East, and exactly how we get there, we'll have to see, but it's clear.
Is this helpful, though, to getting there?
Well, I mean, people said the Abraham Accords and some of the language around that wasn't helpful at the time. Yes, it did for the first time, literally, I think since the 70s in some cases, bring nations to the table and actually re-establish diplomatic relations with countries who had seen, Jewish people being removed, way back in the 50s and 60s. So I think there's, we'll have to let's see. As I said, this is not the way that we're used to the UK Foreign Office, for example, doing business, or those of most other countries. But
now that Boris is Foreign Secretary, anyway.
It's quite early doors. It's quite early doors for the new Trump administration. Let's see. And if we can go anywhere near how he did during the Abraham Accords, maybe there's something which we could, maybe there's some hope.
Tom Hayes.
The people of Gaza want to live in Gaza, and I think the Prime Minister said it really well in Prime Minister's Questions today, which is looking at a photograph of people walking through the rubble, the destruction. It's the job of the international community, which the US will play a major part in, to rebuild Gaza. And I think President Trump, as he said in the statement there, wants to do that rebuilding. He thinks that it's the work of the major democracies to do that. And we also have to make sure that Gaza is free of Hamas. We can't allow Hamas to rebuild their terrorist operations there. We need a reformed Palestinian Authority because rebuilding needs to sustain a long-term peace.
I thought Keir Starmer's comments today were slightly equivocal, and I get why, because he doesn't want to offend Donald Trump. I mean, there's delicate trade talks, no doubt, being held at the moment as well. But surely he could have called out the idea that 2 million Gazans should be forcibly evicted from the place that they've called home.
He said that so many times. He's talked about the importance of a two-state solution, about rebuilding, about getting humanitarian aid into Gaza as quickly as possible, making sure the people there are supported. He said this an awful lot of time. And I think when he did dwell in a really human way on the photograph that he saw and the feelings that it evoked in him, I think it showed both the MPs in the chamber, but also anybody who was watching, that he feels very deeply about the importance of rebuilding.
Is it a source of frustration to you that you and your colleagues on the Labour benches, ministers, particularly in the Foreign Office, particularly the Prime Minister, have to effectively walk a tightrope, that you can't necessarily say what you might like to say about the American president?
I think we are saying what we believe, and we also recognise that in the election that happened in the United States, Donald Trump won a significant majority. He has a mandate from the American people. He's going to be serving for 4 years. We respect the will of the American people in that election. And if Donald Trump, as the chief executive, the head of government and head of state of the United States, says these things, then we will work with the United States as an important ally.
OK. Emma Barr.
Yes.
What's your answer to the question?
I think...
Shall I repeat it?
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Well, I will anyway. Trump has said that everyone he's spoken to loves the idea of the US owning Gaza. Do you?
No. And I think Richard is right on this. I think that if the language that Trump is using is a negotiating strategy and it works, then perhaps the ends justify the means. But it's certainly not the way that we are used to dealing with in the UK. And I think that we should be really careful in endorsing this kind of inflammatory language.
See, I think if Nigel Farage was sitting there representing Reform UK rather than you, he would have said something very, very different.
Well, I'm sure he would, but I'm sitting here as myself, not a representative.
Are you? OK, I thought you were representing Reform UK, silly me. OK, Rupert Reed.
Look, let's start from the fact that ethnic cleansing has been going on for a long time in Palestine, at the West Bank as well as in Gaza. And what Trump is saying just ups the ante further on that. It's extremely disturbing. I want to go big picture on this. What is at stake here, and what I think Keir Starmer has not adequately defended to date, is the concept of the rule of law itself, and the question of whether might makes right, or whether we go back to might-based societies, or whether we maintain some kind of rules-based international order. The question for the kind of world that we thought we inhabit has become, in that sense, existential. And the second way I want to go big picture is by saying the real deep tragedy of the horrendous situation now playing out in the Middle East is that these people are fighting each other and terrible things are being done on both sides, but especially far, far more to the Palestinians. Whereas actually, if you look at this in a long-term perspective, in 20 or 30 years' time, people are going to be struggling to live in that part of the world at all because of the continually rising temperatures from global climate breakdown. What we need to be thinking is not just how do we get to a situation where there can be a Palestinian state, but how do we get to a situation where people can be focusing on the real enemy rather than killing each other? Because sooner or later, that is what they're going to have to focus on.
If you take the deportation bit out of this, which I know you can't, but let's look at it from that point of view. What is wrong with the idea of redeveloping Gaza in a way that makes it a very different place to what it was before?
Well, I'm assuming that Trump's idea for Gaza is not we're going to build lots of lovely big real estate and hotels and whatever, and then we're going to allow the Gazans to return and live in those same places, right? There's long been a fantasy on the Israeli hard right of, well, ethnic cleansing and having resorts, etc., that are there for international tourists and for Israelis. And we have to be worried that there is a possibility that Trump actually means what he says, and it's not just a negotiating gambit.
But if you look at what he's done on tariffs, for example, where he's gone in all guns blazing, and it has had an effect. I mean, it depends how you interpret the effect, I suppose, but he is certainly claiming victory with Canada and Mexico, and the Panamanians are talking about the canal, I think, in some loose sense. So if he does go in all guns blazing, it does seem to have an effect.
Well, let's wait and see what happens in Mexico. Things could look very different in a month's time when that gets reviewed. But look, as I say, the real issue here is, do we allow Donald Trump to go along with Putin and Xi and so on into a situation where we are essentially losing the idea of a rules-based international order and allowing the presidents of powerful countries to dictate to the rest of the world what happens? And I very much hope that the answer to that question is no, that we actually are serious about trying to preserve a rules-based international order.
It's quite difficult, though, when you've got 3 members of the UN Security Council, the 3 leading members,
Very
the 3
difficult.
most powerful members in some ways, maybe you can argue about Russia, but deciding to plough their own furrow. And that, you think, well, what can a country like Britain or France or Germany or other countries all around the world, what can they do about that? But let's take a follow-up text question from Jane, who says, is Donald Trump a genius, gangster, or something else? And if I may, why are we not vociferously calling out this plan like we did when Putin invaded Ukraine and gave our support to Kiev? I'm not sure there's a real parallel there, but I suppose I can see what you mean. Emma?
I'm with you on not quite understanding the parallel. One thing I would like to pick up on, though, is when you say, who are we to allow this? Who do you mean by we?
Well, I was referring back to what Keir Starmer said this afternoon. I think that countries such as Britain, in concert with all other countries of good intent, starting with the countries
Sorry,
in
just
Europe.
pick up on that. So you wouldn't include America as a country of good intent?
Well, the problem is that right now, the United States is run by Trump and an extremist Republican Party such as we have never known before. And of course, there's many Americans who are of good intent, but in terms of the intent of the people who hold the reins of power right now in the United States, I think we have to profoundly mistrust them.
I'm just really trying to drill down onto who you think the moral arbiters are. So you don't think that America, under this current regime, is a country of good intent. You do think Britain is?
I think we could be.
You don't. Do you think France is? Do you think Germany? Where is your line?
I think that those are the kinds of countries, in Poland and so forth, that we have to look to more at this time. But the real point is, do we have a rules-based international order or don't we? And insofar as it's looking increasingly like we don't, we also need to think about how we look after ourselves in that context. And by ourselves, I mean in this country, but also other countries which are in similar positions of being smaller countries threatened by these larger countries. If we are moving back into a situation where might is going to make right much more than we've been used to, we have to be ready to adapt to that situation and have pretty damn serious contingency plans.
So what do you mean by might is going to make right?
What I mean is that Trump is basically trying to say, what I say goes. It's irrelevant what international law says, irrelevant what the International Criminal Court says.
But you should be able to pick who can decide that rather than the US people.
Excuse me, Emma, I'm talking about a rules-based international order, right? So I'm talking about the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, I'm talking about the UN, etc., right? These are the institutions, flawed though they are and failing, frankly, though they are, which we have to, frankly, try to preserve through the very difficult situation we're moving into.
Now, Tom, I'm assuming you don't think Donald Trump is a genius. I'm assuming you're not going to call him a gangster. So what else would you call him?
They're not words that come to mind. I would first of all call him President Donald Trump because, as I said previously, we've got to respect that he won an election.
Such a boring answer.
I apologise. I really do apologise. But I think when we talk about the importance of predictability and certainty, which we're all craving in the Middle East and in international affairs, how much better is it that you've got a government led by somebody who really respects the rule of law? I don't know if you know, but Keir Starmer is a lawyer. And
his dad was a toolmaker.
And his dad was a toolmaker.
I have picked these things up.
Well, we're really pleased as Labour Party communications. But because he does care about the rule of law, and I think uniquely in the club of Western democratic leaders, we actually have a stronger Britain advocating for the rule of law. And what I would say actually is that we need to be having a strengthening of the democratic club. We need to be having closer ties between France and Germany, the UK, the European Union on security issues, because what Rupert is describing is a growing volatility in world affairs. I think all of us around this table agree that the world is more volatile. All of us around this table agree that the UK has an important leadership role to play. The question is, how much can we push that forward given the difficulties that exist in the world?
Richard?
I mean, in a way, the US, and Tom's made this point a couple of times now, that the US is probably more democratic in some ways than it has been, certainly under a Republican president, for a long time, because he didn't just win, he didn't just win on the electoral college. He did win the popular vote as well. By a large margin, a far bigger margin than people thought. If you look at the states where Trump's vote went up more than any others, it was sort of California and New York and places like that. He didn't win overall in those states, but he got a huge, massive increase in number of votes in those states. So I think we do need to be a little bit cautious about branding, as Rupert did, branding the entire the entire US Republican Party as sort of far right. I think given that 70 million, 80 million people voted for Donald Trump this time, I think that's a sort of dangerous place to go down. And I think that every party is a big electoral coalition for a variety of different reasons, particularly in the US case. But I think there's obviously a challenge there. But I think the truth is we also need strength to stand up to what happened in Ukraine. The China, Iran, Russia nexus at the moment as well. And we saw that, I think, in the UK. Both parties have done that since the invasion of Crimea. Never mind the invasion of Ukraine. And I think actually there has been a bit of a gap in some elements of international leadership over the last few years. If you think of as Britain led the way in following and supported by the Labour Party in the House of Commons, and when Russia did invade Ukraine, that wasn't necessarily the case in every European capital. By the way, some of the democratic states that Tom talks about there, France was, President Macron was over there around the table with Putin thinking he could get a deal. The Germans were blocking us sending aid through German airspace at that moment in time, and a lot of people on the left in this country were saying we shouldn't be helping the Ukrainians, just let them, no war, stop there, basically let the Russian tanks roll all the way through to the Polish border. So I think we've just got to, sometimes we need to take a little bit of a pinch of salt, some of those on the far left. I wouldn't say the Labour Party, but some of those perhaps certainly not the main.
But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Tom, that people like Paul Mason, who I think we might have thought would have fallen into that category, Richard, has actually become one of the strongest proponents of Western intervention.
That's true. I was meaning more people like the former Labour leader, who's now an independent MP, Mr. Corbyn.
Well, I'm just very pleased that he accepted that he was an independent MP in saying that. I think we need to also give credit to countries like Germany, who have gone through a historical transformation in their foreign and security policy, and they have in recent years really
still got a bit of way to go, Tom.
I would agree, but they have definitely stepped up and they want to play a larger contribution towards European and international security. And I think we need to take these opportunities because the world is getting more dangerous.
Well, this Conservative-Labour alliance on this panel has got to be shattered, and I think it will be in the next question. But let's go to a break first, 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
At Little
Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
Richard Holden is from the Conservative Party, Tom Hayes from the Labour Party, Emma Barr from Reform UK, and Rupert Reid, who is the director of the Climate Majority Project. 30-second elevator pitch.
So the Climate Majority Project, what we're for is for the broad mass of people who research shows very clearly care about the climate, care about nature, haven't been adequately represented so far. And what we're trying to do is to mainstream climate action and say this isn't about those activists over there. This is about all of us coming together as parents, as teachers, as business people, as local residents, whatever we are, to find our voice together and act together against this threat which is going to sweep us away. And
what does that mean in practical terms?
So it means all sorts of things. So one of the things it means, for a lot of people, what it's going to mean is adaptation work, resilience building work. Because, as I implied 10 or so minutes ago, we are facing a future which is going to be very challenging in terms of the escalating climate emergency. Our governments are not on this sufficiently in this country or any country. So one of the main ways in which people can get involved is by building resilience where they live, along with others. That means things like local food growing. It means things like disaster prevention. It means things like early warning systems. For example, I gave a talk recently in Ilkley on the edge of the Yorkshire Moors. Ilkley is famously a place where there is a moor. Places like that are going to be facing probably a lot more wildfires in the next 5 to 10 years than we've ever had before in this country. We're hopelessly ill-prepared for those wildfires. Unfortunately, local government and national government are not stepping up sufficiently to that. So partly it's about people moving to protect themselves against those kinds of threats.
Right, a question from Scott in West Hampstead. Should Britain be giving up its sovereignty of the Chagos Islands and paying the Mauritius government billions of pounds? And what signal might this give to other countries which lay claim to British territories, such as Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands? Tom Hayes.
I find the debate about this slightly bonkers, particularly in Parliament, because for me it's very simple. Our national security is critical. We have to protect and sustain the military base there. That has been in legal doubt. The Conservative government that we replaced began a process.
How has it been in legal doubt?
Well, because there had to be rounds of negotiations in order to secure it. The Conservative government has undertaken those rounds of negotiations, and this Labour government has completed them. So I really don't understand why this has become such a part of political lightning rod, if I'm honest with you.
But why do we have to give them 9 billion or whatever the figure is? I mean, it's now rumoured to be more than that. Why do we have to give them 9 billion to take back or to take British Islands, which they've never had sovereignty of in the first place?
Well, as a new MP, I'm trying to get to grips with the House of Commons, and I'm not going to moonlight as a Foreign Office official. So I haven't been in those negotiations, but the Foreign Office last night said that the figures that are being floated are nonsense. So I think we have to wait for, as the Prime Minister has said, for the final deal to be concluded and then for that to be brought to the House. And the Prime Minister was very clear that there would be full transparency around that.
Could I just pick up on that? Because I've heard the Labour representatives saying very clearly that 18 billion is nonsense. I've never heard any Labour representative saying the 9 billion is nonsense. So I was wondering if you might be able to clarify that.
I don't think I can add anything to what I've said already, which is that the numbers which have been floated have been repudiated by the Foreign Office recently.
So one of them has, and
my
one of them
understanding
hasn't.
Well, I apologise if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that numbers have been repudiated. I'm sure one of your listeners will text in now to clarify.
But I mean, I guess the argument is that, well, if Mauritius has sovereignty over the whole of the Chagos Islands, we then need to pay rent to keep Diego Garcia as a military base, which admittedly the Americans operate most of it, so presumably they would have to contribute to that. But it still seems odd when the only pressure to deal with this came from the ICC, who issued it wasn't a judgment or a ruling, it was a paper on it. So there was no actual legal imperative to do this. And David Cameron actually stopped these.
It did in January
when he was Foreign Secretary. So I sort of think, well, why was this at the top of the Labour's agenda to try and come to a settlement so early in the government?
I think because so early in the government, you've got a litany of issues that have to be addressed, which are holdovers, legacy issues from the previous government, and this is one of those issues. And it was important to take it forward for all the reasons I was just saying.
Rupert.
So I'd like to take a step back here. What I know about the Chagos Islands is mostly about the history of British rule there and the way that the Chagos Islanders have been treated, which is pretty terrible. And what I find unsatisfying
They still want to stay under British rule, of course, which I find slightly odd, but they do. generally?
Yeah, well, it's complicated. There's a really good account in Mark Curtis's book, Unpeople, of the way the Chagos Islanders have been treated historically. And what I'm anxious in this discussion and the political spat and so forth is that we don't forget about them. This isn't just about Britain and the British Empire and about our military bases and about Mauritius and so on. This is about people who live there and who have homes there. So that would be my priority, making sure that whatever the outcome of this, it actually is something that actually works for those islanders.
But does it mystify you as to why there was any impetus at all to change the situation, given that Mauritius has never actually held sovereignty over the Chagos Islands? I mean, it's, 1,500 miles away from them anyway. Why is there this rush to deal with it?
Of course, it's considerably further away from us.
Well, of course it is. But so what? So the Falklands?
Yeah, well, yes, and what's going to be the long-term future of the Falklands? I don't know. Will the Falklands still be under British rule in 2100? I wouldn't be surprised if they're not. Look, my point is, what matters is the wishes of and the decent treatment of the islanders. That's very different in relation to Chagos than in relation to the Falklands, because the Chagos Islanders have been seriously oppressed in a way that the Falkland Islanders never have.
Well, I think actually the Falkland Islanders might disagree with that, seeing as they were invaded by a military junta. Well, quite, because I mean, I do get the impression a little bit that Rupert's version of history is like, well, it only matters if it's the UK who oppress.
No, it's about us taking responsibility for our past mistakes.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, quite. So I don't quite understand why, and therefore the British government, as it is now, has totally ignored the views of the Chagos Islanders, who are now living in, largely in Mauritius. So I just think the idea that we give, we'll have to find out the numbers, but I did actually ask one of the cabinet ministers. I was on telly earlier today with her on the BBC. Could she give a number? She said she like Tom has done rubbish these numbers and then couldn't give a number. So and the government has.
Well, to be fair, it wasn't her department.
No, absolutely, you're absolutely right. But the idea of being able to say, well, it's not true that it's 18 billion when that's been widely reported in the press, or it's not true. We're not sure whether it's true that it's 9 billion when again that's been widely reported by Foreign Office sources. I mean, it just seems that these are big questions, and this is a lot of money, right? 18 billion is almost over that time period 200 million pounds a year, and also the Mauritians have said they would like to see that front loaded. And when you think about we're removing, the government's just announced it is removing now from pensions on the winter fuel payment. That's costing about 1.2 billion a year. So it's a lot of it's a chunk of that.
And what you're saying, I mean, it's all valid, but of course, understandably, people come to the fact that it was your government that actually started this when you were chairman of the Conservative Party, when you were a minister.
Well, actually, that's not quite true. Actually, when I was chairman of the Conservative Party, these negotiations were stopped by David Cameron, and so actually this so that's actually what did happen. Obviously they were started when you're absolutely right, but I think David Cameron clearly saw them hitting a dead end. I actually pick up on the point that you made at the start, Iain, which was that this was a decision which quickly arrived at between July and October. It's one of the first things that the new Labour government did was to not just restart these negotiations but come to a conclusion of them incredibly quickly, with a huge price tag attached, with big question marks over our role with the Americans and the future importance of this area as well, and obviously with that I think it was an advisory paper by one of these international bodies. All of that to me does not smack of what Keir Starmer seemed to be suggesting in the House of Commons today, which was this is a slam dunk case. We had to press ahead now. There's a lot of money on the table here, and it does seem to me that to pay somebody to have territory of ours which was never theirs in the first place, without any say of the Chagos Islanders themselves as to their future, did seem to me a bit of a rush job, and there's got to be questions that have got to be asked around why it's been done in this way and who is involved in doing it.
I really have to say, listening to that, it just reminds me of what I see when I stare at the Conservative benches in the House of Commons. The Conservative Party is fundamentally broken and demoralised. No wonder you're speculating, because there is nothing that you actually can argue which is credible in the way of opposition. And the Prime Minister
you won't give us a figure, will you?
Well, this is what I'm saying.
You didn't even know the figures.
You're speculating when the Prime Minister
Well,
said that the full figures are going to become clean in the House of Commons.
Well, you announced your decision back in October.
Maybe if you just wait a little bit and show a bit of patience, that would be fine. But if I
hang
may,
on
the Prime Minister did...
It's perfectly reasonable to ask, when the decision has been announced, it's perfectly reasonable to ask, what are the figures?
And the figures are still being worked through in the negotiations, but there was a charge levelled at Kemi Badenoch, which is that there's a standing invitation to take a national security briefing on the Chagos Islands. Has she taken that briefing?
Well, let me.
Has she taken that briefing?
Well, I don't know whether or not when she was in government, whether she took.
Has she taken the briefing as leader of the opposition, based on which the offer was made?
Exactly. I don't think. I'm not sure.
You don't know what your leader of the opposition.
Let me answer your first question, Tom, and then we'll come on to your subsequent questions, which will fall away.
Yes or no? It's very simple.
Come on, we're not going to have a rerun of lunchtime.
The first question, mate. So I think in the answer to the question, does she know what's going on in the Chagos Islands?
That wasn't my
Absolutely. She was in the cabinet at the time when the Chagos Islands were when David Cameron stopped the negotiation.
Was, has she had a national security
let me finish.
Since the new government took office,
that wasn't your question, really. And also, who cares whether she's had one since the new government took office? Because unless you can point to me at something that happened between July and October, when this government made that decision, which had actually fundamentally changed the issue, then it's all irrelevant.
Why are we debating this if you're saying that what the government has done since July onwards is immaterial that the leader of the opposition doesn't need a national security briefing on it?
That literally doesn't make sense. You literally made a decision. Keir Starmer is saying in October the government had made a new decision. He's not indicated. He's not said that national security issues had changed in that period since the Conservatives left office. Did he?
We're talking about a military base.
Did he actually say that, Tom?
We're talking about a military base.
So has anything changed since between July and October when he made the decision?
It's bonkers to me.
Exactly. It's absolute nonsense. Honestly, it's a total straw man argument put up by the Labour Party, and Tom's been sent on here to talk it up. It's absolute nonsense. There's absolutely no security.
Well, he hasn't. To be fair, he hasn't been sent on here to talk this up. We invited him on, just as we invited you on. So
this is the Labour line that this is the attack line he used at PMQs. I mean, it's just there's nothing to it.
I think that to say that why are we speculating about figures when clearly that is the conversation is frankly, and to use your term, bonkers. Why should the opposition not be able to speculate about the figures if you're going to rule out one of those figures? Because by ruling one out, therefore it means you must have some idea of what the real figure is.
I can't believe we're still talking about this. This is such
£18 billion of public money, potentially.
The government have said they're going to come forward with the true cost, and at that point, if there is a cost, Parliament will be able to debate it. Richard will be able to stand up in House of Commons and ask questions of government ministers. If you can rule a figure out, that must mean that you know what a figure might be, surely. Because if you have absolutely no idea, then you can't rule anything out.
I think it's the principle is important here too. Sort of, why would we sort of commit this, whatever the figure is, why would we commit taxpayers' money to pay this amount of money to a government that actually we have no need to because we held sovereignty and we could have kept holding sovereignty? But that's just my two pence. We will move on to different subjects in just a moment. Tom will be very pleased. It's 8:33 on LBC. Daryl Jackson has news headlines.
The chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee has told LBC Donald Trump's plan for Gaza is illegal, immoral and won't work. But speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr, Emily Thornberry said it's positive the president is thinking about what its future holds. A report into the handling of Axel Rudikabana by the UK's counter-terror programme has found he had an interest in the Manchester Arena attack. It also found that Prevent closed the case into the Southport attacker prematurely. And families of the Nottingham attack victims say a new review shows their killers should face a retrial for murder. Prosecutors accepted Valdo Calacane's manslaughter plea because of his schizophrenia, but the report reveals he avoided taking medication. LBC weather dry tonight with isolated showers in northern and western Scotland. These will ease overnight with a low of -3.
This is LBC.
Why
leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:36. We've just been talking about one of Tom Hayes' constituents, who's a listener to the programme, Terry in Bournemouth, who's a Meatloaf impersonator, who I'm going to see a gig of his with Jackie Smith in Malvern in 3 weeks' time. The things we do.
Can I say hello to Terry, because I've met Terry before and he's fantastic.
He is fantastic. He even looks like Meatloaf. Right, we have with us Richard Holden, Rupert Reid, Tom Hayes and Emma Barr. Charlie is in Gaul. Hello, Charlie.
Hiya, mate. How are you doing?
All right, thank you. What would you like to ask?
Did you see that last week the courts came and said that Rosebank and the other one was illegal? Well, what I wanted to know, what's your panel's position on this, given that it could give a lot of jobs, but climate change says it could kill a lot of people?
So it's been reported that the Prime Minister and Chancellor are set to approve drilling for oil in the large Rosebank site in the North Sea, despite concerns raised by the Environment Secretary, Ed Miliband. Doesn't seem to be a very good few weeks for the Environment Secretary. Rupert, let's come to you first. This is your area.
Yeah, well, let's start off by being very clear on what's happened here. So Labour went into the last election saying there would be no new licences for oil and gas. And these licences have now been knocked back by the courts. So Labour, according to their manifesto, are absolutely committed to not going ahead now in Rosebank. But the signs are not looking good.
Well, isn't that being a bit semantic?
I don't think so. I think it's very, very clear.
It wouldn't be a new licence, would
it would be a new licence, because there is no licence now for Rosebank. The court has knocked it out and said, nope, that goes right back. It's back to the government. So there's really no way around this for Labour. If they want to stand by their manifesto commitments, they have to say no to Rosebank. It looks very likely that they're going to say yes to Rosebank. If that happens, it will be an enormous betrayal. Ed Miliband, who I know and respect, should resign if that happens. And really, this is a desperately worrying sign amidst a whole lot, as you say, Iain, of how far this government has retreated from what it seemed to be promising on the environment and on climate at the time of the last election. It's desperately worrying at a time when what we need is we see the world's climate, frankly, starting to spin out of control. If you look at what's happened recently in LA, if you look at the epidemic of flooding around the world last year, we desperately need for there to be some kind of leadership now on this, and it looks like Labour are not going to offer any.
But do you not accept, though, there's still going to be a need for gas and oil even in 2050? I mean, a much smaller proportion of our energy needs. But if we still need to have oil and gas, surely it's better to drill our own.
Well, firstly, that's actually not clear. If you are going to have any new oil and gas, then you want to take it from the places where it is the easiest to get at. And that is no longer the case in the North Sea oil fields. These are dying oil fields. This is a dying industry. The caller mentioned jobs. There is far more scope for jobs in renewable energy, in retrofitting houses, in the things that we desperately need to do, which governments have criminally neglected for so long. So the jobs argument is a red herring. The energy argument in this island nation with so much solar and wind and so forth is a red herring.
Okay. Emma?
I think to say that the Labour government either have or haven't broken their manifesto isn't really relevant to this. I think that you can say that...
It's relevant if you care about honest politics, isn't it?
Well, you could argue it either way, whether it's a new lease or not a new lease, right? I mean, whether it's coming back, does that make it a new lease, or does it not make it a new lease? I'm sure Labour would have a view on this as well.
More income for lawyers.
Yeah, well, very droll. But in terms of the principle, I do think that they're right to continue, because we are going to need to have some sort of continuation as we move to more green energy.
Richard?
Look, I mean, this is a bit of a chaotic situation that Labour's found itself in, because they decided not to try and defend the position that the previous Conservative government had taken, which was to try and press ahead with these against the objections of some of the environmental activists who'd taken the government to court over them. And then now they seem to have reverse ferreted position to try and suggest that actually, well, given the dire economic situation that they've created with the budget, which has also massively hiked national insurance contributions and absolutely crashed growth in the economy in the last few months under Rachel Reeves, they're now having to look at, well, what can we do to try and get something going quickly? And so I think that's the reason they're now in this position. Look, I think we're going to need. We already know that, you know, all the 2050 stats say we'll need to use oil and gas from somewhere for a part of our energy mix by then. Even as we do more offshore wind, more and all sorts of other things, we're still going to need a proportion of oil and gas. I just think if we're going to need it, then we should drill it in the UK and have those jobs in the UK. And these are well-paid jobs in North East Scotland, and also the supply chain for that sector is right across places from my constituency, where you've got engineering and service sectors, all the way up to heavy engineering in the northeast of England, who all supply this sector as well. So the knock-on consequences of not doing this, I think, will be a mistake. I hope, can we really press the Prime Minister on this today? I hope that the government does change its position, but we'll have to see.
I think this is, again, a bonkers debate. You've got the Green argument being made here.
Why do you keep saying these are bonkers debates?
If I may. You've got the Green argument being levelled here that apparently this Labour government is not green enough. You've got Ed Miliband returning to the job that he left 16 years ago with all the knowledge that he's acquired in that interim, and he has consented to record-breaking renewable energy. He has lifted the wind ban. He is set out to create the National Energy System Operator. We've got emission control. There's so many things that are happening in this space. You've got Richard actually attacking the government for being too green. But then you listen to Richard, and he feels like a million miles away from Theresa May, who introduced the net zero law, and from Boris Johnson, who actually brought in some of the early investments to make that a reality. The Conservative Party, led by Kemi Badenoch, was calling environmentalists eco-nutters today. This is how far away the Conservative Party has moved from its record in government.
Tom, can I ask you?
Hang on. What about the question? What about the question? Should we prevent the approval of the Rosebank oil field due to climate concerns?
So the Labour Party was clear in its manifesto that there would be no issuing of new licences.
Exactly.
So you think that it shouldn't be renewed, and if Rachel Reeves announces next week that it will be, you'll vote against that?
So I was elected on a manifesto which said that there will be no issuing of new licences, and that's the Labour Party's position.
So there should be no new Rosebank then? There should be no Rosebank?
No issuing of new licences being taken by this government. And I think it's really important.
Would you class that as a new licence?
Well, it depends on what the detail is, and it's a matter for the courts at the moment when it comes to Rosebank. But what I would say is...
It's not a matter for the courts whether it's a new licence. It's
a matter for the government.
But what I would also say is...
That's what the courts have exactly said.
That we have heard Richard here talking about the issuing of new licences as a way of creating jobs. The Tories issued over 400 new licences, and there was a halving of jobs in this sector. We need to be sprinting towards clean energy. That's the way of generating jobs and growth in our country.
You don't sprint towards clean energy by licensing Rosebank.
As far away from the needs of the clean energy sector as you can possibly get.
Nonsense. I mean,
when I talk with businesses, senior business leaders about what they want, they're excited.
What they want is you to reverse your national insurance tax, which is costing jobs right up and down the country.
And excited by the passionate commitment of the Energy Secretary.
Shall we just introduce very briefly another aspect of this? It's a question from Rob. He says, do you think there is a level of protest that could be deemed as terrorism? Where is the line between protesting and terrorising the public for a cause? Now, this is on the back of the Court of Appeal, currently considering the appeals of 16 Just Stop Oil protesters who were jailed for up to 5 years for various demonstrations, including climbing onto gantries over the M25 and throwing soup over Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers painting. Very quick answers from each of you. Emma, let's start with you.
If it's illegal, then it should be illegal, whatever the reason you are protesting. And I think that's a very clear line.
But do you regard it as terrorism?
No, because in some cases, perhaps, but I think that the point is, if you're doing something illegal, it shouldn't matter the reason why you're doing it. You should be held to the same standard as everyone else. And that goes for Just Stop Oil protesters, and it goes for any other protest.
I'm sure you've been on one or two of these protests, Rupert.
Well, not just up oil ones, I haven't. No,
Sorry, I didn't mean to imply that you had.
The climate majority project approach is completely different from the Just Stop Oil approach. But I would say, in fairness to the Just Stop Oil people, these are thoroughly non-violent protesters. They're not hurting anybody. They're
hurting people trying to get to work.
They're not hurting anybody. They're thoroughly non-violent protesters. If they throw soup at a work of art, I think that's a really dumb thing to do, frankly. But it's a million miles away from terrorism.
Do you honestly think that someone who is being paid by the hour, who can't get to work, they are not hurting them and their family by preventing them from getting to work and earning that wage?
They're not hurting them in the sense of doing them violence.
So it has to be physical violence. So it has to be physical violence for it to count as hurting someone.
Excuse me, the question is, was it terrorism? If you stop someone from getting to work, that may be a stupid and unpleasant thing to do. It's stupid to call it terrorism.
You said it wasn't harming them.
I said it wasn't causing them hurt or injury.
I think we all know what terrorism looks like, and protests that have been described here clearly not terrorism. I would completely agree with what you're saying here, though, that people have a right to make their way to work, to go about their business, and these protesters are not doing anything to galvanise support for the clean energy mission that the government is embarking upon by doing this sort of activity.
Richard?
I don't want to comment on the individual cases, obviously, because they're before the Court of Appeal, but I would say that in a lot of these cases, this wasn't somebody being arrested for their first protest. These are people who'd often breached multiple court orders multiple times and were causing huge amounts of... and while they were out on bail, were then going and doing more of this sort of thing. So it's not quite as straightforward as might be suggested, that the idea that we're getting very long sentences for, say, a protest. That's not the case. These are people who've been convicted multiple times and were deliberately putting two fingers up to the law in many cases.
Your point, Tom, about the fact that, they weren't encouraging people to support their cause by doing this. And it seems to me, from what you're saying, Rupert, that you kind of get that.
Yeah.
And your group is not going to indulge in this sort of thing.
We're here
I can't think of a single person who's converted to the environmental argument by those sorts of activities.
Yeah, what we're trying to do in the Climate Majority Project is to be there for everyone who's like, look, I get that there's a real issue here and we've got to do something about it, but that's not the way to go about it. So we invite all those people to come to us.
Right. We'll move on. It's 8:48.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Richard Holden, Rupert Reid, Tom Hayes and Emma Barr with me taking your questions. The next one is from James in Hitchin. Is postponing local elections political cowardice, as Nigel Farage has claimed? And are the mainstream parties running scared of reform? Well, local elections, which were due to take place in May, have been delayed for 1 year in 9 areas of England to allow the government's planned major reforms to local authorities to take place. The reforms will see small district councils merged with the county councils, which cover the same territory, to form one larger local authority. Tom, let's come to you first on this. It's said that only dictators abolish elections. Is that, obviously you'll think that's an unfair accusation here, but why not still have local representation for the year that this is going to take to bring about?
Because it'll cost an awful lot of money to elect councillors who will be in post for a year when we've already got councillors who are elected. And I just don't think that the public would look at that as a good investment. I think they would think their government isn't on their side by committing that level of funding. And it's worth saying too that the councils that have opted to go for a devolution deal knew at the time that there was a risk there wouldn't be elections going ahead. So I think it's about saving public money and making sure that you've got a movement towards better councils.
Richard?
I think, I really don't like postponing elections unless absolutely necessary. We did during COVID, for example, but I really don't like postponing them unless absolutely necessary.
To be fair, you'd save a few more councillors by postponing them.
Well, we obviously don't make that decision. Those decisions are made by the government as to whether or not they are. And I would just say, look, I've been out on the campaign trail recently. I was in Stock recently, just neighbouring my seat, Basildon, Billericay, where we had a Conservative death and a strong challenge from Reform, but we held that seat relatively comfortably. So, you know, it's not what I'd like to see. And I think the government's basically said to a lot of these areas, because they're not actually postponing the elections for these councils, what's going to happen is they're going to be brand new councils in place of them. So in Essex, you're seeing over a dozen district councils and the county council being chopped up, and we don't actually know how many new councils we're going to get yet under the new devolution proposals. So basically the government has said, look, if you want to carry on with this devolution, have more powers over the transport, have more powers over the economy, you've got to go down this fast track approach. And they basically said, and part of that is your elections are going to be postponed. So
you
they didn't really have a choice.
Dismiss the challenge from Reform, but you know as well as I do that it was Reform essentially that won Labour their majority, because they did their intervention meant that a lot of seats, and I suspect yours was one of them, Tom, but feel free to convince me otherwise, that if they got 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 votes, a lot of those votes would have been Conservative votes.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean there's no doubt about that at all. That Reform did cost Conservatives a lot of seats when it came to the general election, and only won 5 seats themselves.
I've got two questions in PMQs today.
And a UQ, and an urgent question.
Yeah, very interesting. Emma?
I don't think there's any price too high for democracy, so they should carry on, no matter what the cost.
Okay. Brief and to the point. Rupert?
I want to take up the aspect of the question on running scared. I think the government are running scared. I suspect the Conservatives are running scared too. I think the really significant thing about the general election results we just had is that you've got a massive increase, obviously, in the number of Reform MPs, a huge increase in the number of Green MPs. It wouldn't surprise me, Iain, if you're still doing this programme in 2040, if you're sitting here not with
78.
Not with Tom and Richard from the government and the opposition parties, but with a Reform and Green Party as government and opposition. I don't know which way around they'll be. People are looking. Hang on. People are looking. People are looking for something different. We've seen that very clearly in America. We're seeing it here as well. These insurgent parties are going to get stronger and stronger, and that is, I think, going to be what the long-term actual debate is in this country. Do you go for something like Reform, or do you go for something like Green? I think the century of hegemony from those parties. I think we've
just got time to fit in one more question from Paul in Bolton. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Iain. I'll say it quickly. 4 of the Labour rebels who rebelled against the King's speech last summer, they've got the whip back, but 3 of them haven't. So do you think it's time for these 3, led by John McDonnell, to reject the Labour Party, cross the floor and join forces with Jeremy Corbyn and the other independents to become the force biggest political party in the House of Commons? Because we keep getting told that reform's the only option, but how about we have a proper left-wing political party in the UK?
Well, Richard Bergen, Ian Byrne, Imran Hussain and Rebecca Long-Bailey, they were given the whip back today, but John McDonnell, Apsana Begum and Zara Sultana were not. Now, this is 6 months after they and those other MPs were suspended for voting in favour of an SNP motion which called for the 2-child limit on child benefit to be scrapped. Tom?
I'm not a whip, so I don't know what the conversations have been. But if those three individuals want to form their own party within Parliament, then they're very welcome to go and do that.
Oh, that's interesting you put it that way, because I thought you might say, well, they're very valued colleagues and would obviously love them to have them back, assuming they are going to play ball.
I think people are free to do as they choose.
Richard?
Well, I do take a little bit of issue with Tom. I mean, if people are elected on a party's manifesto, then I think, by and large, unless something dramatic changes, I think they should really stick with that.
How many people did Boris kick out of the party?
Well, they should, by and large, stick with that party.
How many people did he kick out?
And it's
he kicked out Ken Clarke, didn't he?
Just
Ken Clarke, who has served the Conservative Party for decade after decade, one of the biggest stalwarts of the movement.
He did vote against the government on a confidence vote, and we all know that normally means that you then lose the whip.
I understand that Tom thinks probably he's not been a whip, and so maybe he thinks
not yet.
You're quite right. He's got a long, illustrious career ahead of him, and I'm sure that when he will be arguing exactly the point he's just made when people vote against his government on confidence motions
Rupert.
In future.
I think it's a very interesting question. It speaks again to this question of the possibility of new insurgent parties rising. I'll just make one specific point about John McDonnell. He is one of the MPs who, above all others, really gets the importance of and what needs to be done on climate. I think any party should be looking to get him, whether it's Labour or the Independents or the Greens or a new party.
Emma?
I think the interesting question, and forgive me if I haven't seen this, is do they want the whip back? They still want to be part of the Labour, so they want the whip back.
I think Zara Sultana in particular, though, is pretty annoyed today because she read about this in the media rather than being told by the
that
Labour
part
whips.
of it I do think
there is, Ian, something else which has happened around this, and I'm on the procedure committee in Parliament. There's part of looking at this at the moment.
Exciting life.
I do honestly. You've got no idea. And one of the things is, obviously, there's 5 independents elected, all on there's what's been known as a Gaza independence in Parliament, the election. But because they weren't elected under a party platform, they don't get the same sort of support as, say, other parties which have got the same number of MPs in Parliament. And there is a sort of debate at the moment as to whether they should, and that would obviously have a big impact on perhaps some of the more left-wing members who were elected as Labour MPs as to their future as well. So I think there's an interesting debate there as to what should happen, and would it encourage, given the sort of small majority of people like Wes Streeting, as well as myself, obviously.
How big your majority?
It's very small, but
20.
I mean, it is indeed 20.
I guess the interesting thing here is, will we see Conservatives defect to reform in Parliament?
Well, who knows? I think the other interesting thing is in the Republic of Ireland, they're having a similar debate to that one, and because they've got a group of independents who's joined the coalition, but they still want to be treated as opposition, even though they're in government. How Irish can you... No, I mustn't say that. Right, our fun question from Gemma in Putney. The Louvre has been coming under an increasing amount of criticism for the bad time that visitors are having when visiting it. Which tourist site have you been excited to see but found to be extremely underwhelming? Rupert?
So many years ago, I did my PhD in the United States, and I visited the Statue of Liberty, and I've got to tell you, it is really quite small.
Emma?
Mine would be going back a few decades, but the Millennium Dome. Definitely when I was younger, because I was so excited, and then it was basically sort of a glorified, felt like a sort of Legoland.
It's great now, though. Tom?
I'm going to get into hot water for this, but the only thing I can genuinely think of, and it's not quite a tourist site, is Anfield, because it is much, much smaller and less impressive.
Are you an Evertonian?
Than I would have imagined. I am absolutely not an Evertonian, but if Evertonians want solidarity, I'm here for them.
What are you?
I am an AFC Bournemouth fan.
As you should be. They're doing rather well at the moment.
They're doing really well, as they told the Prime Minister. They beat his team.
Richard? Maybe that's not the best career move you've ever had.
I also told the leader of the House that we'd beaten Manchester City too.
Dear. You see, we thought you'd have a long, illustrious career, but you've just proved
We were backing you all the way, Tom. Honestly, I did a lot of... When I was roads minister, I did a huge amount of driving around the country, as you can imagine. And I always thought that the way that Stonehenge was situated on the side of that road and the accidents it caused and everything else was terrible. So I was always in favour of the Stonehenge tunnel. And I was really disappointed when the new government cancelled it just a few months in.
Right. Thank you all very much indeed. On Monday, we have the President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews with us, Phil Rosenberg, Conservative Shadow Business Minister Jerome Mayhew, Liberal Democrat Health Spokesperson Jess Brown-Fuller, and the former Conservative Policy Advisor Salma Shah. Now, coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about childhood mental health. It's said to be in crisis. And I really want to know, there is a hook for this because it is Childhood Mental Health Week this week. But I want to know if you have a child, whatever age, who is experiencing issues with mental health, as a parent, given that you've probably got no experience in this matter, how do you cope? How do you help your child get through these kinds of issues? 0345 6060 973. So what are your family's experiences of trying to access children's mental health support as well?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the White House says a US president is committed to rebuilding Gaza